In the 18th of June, 75, 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors faced 650 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry along the Little Bighorn, where 210 of Major Marcus Reno's men fell or fled within an hour. Reno, his blue uniform torn, clutched a revolver in his right hand, his horse tethered nearby. Captain Frederick Benteen, holding Custer's final note in his gloved left hand, stood beside his mount, its reins loose. Historian Evan S. Connell calls Reno's retreat a catastrophe of indecision, while 225 of Custer's men fought 3 miles away. As native warriors defended their families with unmatched resolve, why did Reno and Benteen, with 350 troops, not march to save Custer's command? Discover the truth of this pivotal clash. Captain Frederick Benteen, his blue uniform dusted with the grit of a long ride, led 120 men of companies H, D, and K back to the main trail along Reno Creek on the 25th of June, 1875. His weathered face, framed by a graying beard, showed the strain of a fruitless scout across rugged terrain. The pack train, with 140 mules carrying vital ammunition and supplies, trailed a mile east under Captain Thomas McDougall's watch. Benteen's return to the trail marked a critical juncture, as his 3 companies, each with 40 men, were now poised to rejoin the 7th Cavalry's main effort against an estimated 500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Historian Robert M. Utley notes Benteen's scout, covering 10 miles of broken ground, yielded no trace of the native village, raising questions about its necessity when time was scarce. The reunion with the trail set Benteen on a collision course with destiny, as Custer's command, 650 strong, pressed deeper into the Little Bighorn Valley. Benteen halted his column at a marshy stretch known as the morass, where sparse grass and shallow water offered respite. His men, weary from hours in the saddle, dismounted to rest, while 120 horses drank from the muddy pools. The stop lasted 15 to 20 minutes, a decision that sparked fierce debate. Benteen, sitting on a fallen log with his canteen in hand, likely weighed the need to refresh his force against the urgency of Custer's orders. Critics, including historian Stephen E. Ambrose, argue this pause cost precious time, with Ambrose stating, Benteen's linger at the morass was a tactical blunder when every minute counted. Yet, the 90-degree heat and the horses' exhaustion, each carrying a 200-pound load of rider, gear, and ammunition, demanded a brief halt to maintain combat readiness. The morass, a mere 2 miles from the lone teepee, became a lightning rod for scrutiny, as Benteen's delay contrasted with the escalating battle just 5 miles downstream. The accusation that Benteen squandered time at the morass has fueled controversy for decades. Detractors point to the 20-minute stop as evidence of indecision, with one 1876 military inquiry noting, Benteen's pause could have hastened his arrival by a critical margin. His 120 men, armed with Springfield carbines and Colt revolvers, were fresh compared to Reno's battered force of 210, already engaged with 800 warriors in the valley. Supporters, however, argue the halt was prudent. Historian John S. Gray calculates that Benteen's horses, marching 25 miles that day, risked collapse without water. The morass, though sluggish, provided the only reliable source for miles. Benteen's choice reflected a balance between immediate action and sustaining his command's mobility, yet the shadow of Custer's fate, 225 men annihilated 3 miles away, casts his decision in a harsh light. The debate persists. Was Benteen cautious or negligent? Captain Thomas Weir, commanding Company D, grew restless as the minutes ticked by. His tall frame, clad in a sweat-stained tunic, leaned forward on his bay horse, his right hand gripping the reins tightly. Weir, known for his impatience, turned to Lieutenant William Godfrey, who stood nearby adjusting his kepi. Weir proposed confronting Benteen to resume the march, his voice sharp with urgency. Company D, with 40 troopers, had led the column's advance, and Weir felt the weight of inaction. The morass, surrounded by low hills, offered no view of the battle, but faint echoes of gunfire, carried 5 miles by the wind, hinted at the chaos unfolding. Weir's agitation reflected the broader tension within the 7th Cavalry, where 12 companies operated with fractured coordination. His push to move forward underscored a critical moment as the clock ticked toward Custer's final stand. Godfrey, a stocky officer with a reputation for caution, refused Weir's suggestion. Standing beside his horse, his left hand resting on his saber, Godfrey avoided a direct clash with Benteen, his superior. The decision revealed the delicate hierarchy among officers, where personal loyalties and rivalries shaped actions. Godfrey's Company K, also 40 strong, had endured the same grueling march, and his reluctance may have stemmed from fatigue or deference. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick describes Godfrey as a steady but uninspiring leader, suggesting his inaction at the morass reflected a broader paralysis among Custer's subordinates. The refusal left Weir isolated, amplifying the strain between the 7th's officers. With 350 men under Benteen and Reno still unaccounted for, Godfrey's hesitation marked a missed chance to unify the column's purpose. Weir, undeterred, acted alone. He mounted his horse, his spurs glinting in the midday sun, and led Company D down the trail without orders. His 40 troopers, carbines slung across their backs, followed in a tight column, kicking up dust along Reno Creek. The move, bold and reckless, forced Benteen's hand. Weir's defiance, as historian Evan S. Connell notes, lit a spark under Benteen, who could not afford to lose control. The unauthorized advance, covering a quarter-mile in minutes, exposed the fragility of Benteen's command. Weir's men, though fatigued, maintained discipline, their horses trotting at 6 miles per hour. The action shifted the momentum, compelling Benteen to respond or risk further division within his 120-man force. Benteen, his face flushed with irritation, ordered the entire column to follow. He swung into his saddle, his right hand clutching the reins, and took his place at the head of companies H, D, and K. The 120 troopers, spread across a 200-yard line, moved westward, their hoofbeats drowning out the distant gunfire. Benteen's swift reaction restored order, but the episode underscored his strained leadership. Utley argues, Benteen's authority was tested by Weir's insubordination, revealing cracks in the 7th's cohesion. The column, now unified, covered 1 mile in 10 minutes, closing the gap to the lone tepe. Benteen's resumption of command set the stage for the critical decisions awaiting him, as Custer's fate hung in the balance 4 miles away. A mile west, Benteen halted to inspect a burning teepee, its blackened poles smoldering in the dust. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry grass, and examined the site with his adjutant. The teepee, likely a Sioux burial lodge, held the body of a warrior, a grim portent of the conflict ahead. The stop lasted mere minutes, but its symbolism was stark. The 7th Cavalry was entering a battlefield where 1,500 native warriors awaited. Philbrick notes, the burning teepee was a warning Benteen could not ignore, yet he pressed on. The 120 men, watching the smoke rise, felt the weight of the moment. Benteen remounted, his horse snorting, and led the column forward, now 3 miles from the village where Reno's 210 men fought for survival. As the column advanced along Reno Creek, the sound of gunfire grew louder, rolling across the valley. Benteen, riding at the front, tilted his head to listen, his kepi shielding his eyes from the sun. The 120 troopers, their carbines at the ready, sensed the battle's proximity, now 2 miles away. The gunfire, sharp and sporadic, suggested a clash involving hundreds, as Reno's force faced 800 warriors. Connell writes, the sound of combat was Benteen's first clear signal that Custer's plan had unraveled. The terrain, dotted with sagebrush and low ridges, offered no clear view, but the escalating noise drove Benteen to quicken the pace. His column, moving at a trot of 8 miles per hour, closed the distance, unaware that Custer's 225 men were already encircled 3 miles north. Daniel Knipe, a trooper with dust-caked boots, galloped past Benteen's column, his horse lathered with sweat. Clinging to his reins with his left hand, Knipe shouted for Benteen to hurry, claiming the main force needed him urgently. His message, possibly from Tom Custer, carried the weight of desperation, as Reno's 210 men suffered 40% casualties in the valley. Knipe's ride, covering 1 mile in 5 minutes, underscored the chaos engulfing the 7th Cavalry. Ambrose notes, Knipe's plea was a cry from a disintegrating command, yet Benteen had no context for its urgency. The 120 troopers, catching Knipe's words, tightened their grips on their weapons, sensing the battle's gravity. Benteen, his eyes narrowed, pressed forward, now 2 miles from the fight, as the Sioux and Cheyenne fought to protect their 7,000-person village. Private John Martin, his blue uniform soaked with sweat, galloped toward Captain Frederick Benteen's column, clutching a scrawled note in his right hand. On the 25th of June, 1875, Martin, a 24-year-old Italian-born trumpeter, rode his lathered horse across 2 miles of rugged terrain to deliver General George Custer's final order. The note, penned by Adjutant William Cook, directed Benteen to come quickly with his 120 men and bring the pack train's 140 mules, laden with 24,000 rounds of ammunition. Benteen, sitting tall on his gray horse, took the note and read it under the midday sun, his weathered face tightening. Historian Robert M. Utley calls this message Custer's last clear directive. But its vague urgency left Benteen with more questions than answers. Martin's arrival, after a 10-minute ride at 12 miles per hour, marked a pivotal moment, as Custer's 225 men fought 3 miles north against 500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors defending their 7,000-person village. Benteen, his kepi tilted back, passed the note to his company commanders Captain Thomas Weir, Lieutenant William Godfrey, and Captain George Yates standing beside their horses. The 120 troopers of Companies H, D, and K, each armed with a Springfield carbine and 100 rounds, waited in a loose formation along Reno Creek. The officers, their faces grim under dust-caked beards, read the note but offered no comments. A silence that spoke volumes. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick notes, the lack of discussion among Benteen's officers reflected the 7th Cavalry's fractured command structure. With Major Marcus Reno's 210 men engaged 2 miles downstream and Custer's force out of sight, the absence of input left Benteen to interpret Custer's intent alone. The moment, lasting mere minutes, underscored the isolation of Benteen's column. Now 4 miles from the pack train and 3 miles from the battle's heart. Benteen turned to Martin, his voice sharp, and asked where Custer was. Martin, still catching his breath, pointed north and replied that Custer was 3 miles away, adding that Reno was charging the village. Standing beside his horse, its reins in his left hand, Martin's words painted a chaotic picture. Reno's 210 men, including 35 Crow Scouts, had attacked a village of 800 warriors, suffering 40 casualties in 20 minutes. Benteen, his eyes narrowing, processed the news. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose argues, Martin's report gave Benteen a fleeting glimpse of the disaster unfolding, yet it lacked specifics. The village, home to 7,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, including 2,000 women and children, was no easy target. Martin's claim of Reno's charge, likely exaggerated, clashed with the reality of Reno's retreat, setting the stage for Benteen's critical decision. Benteen faced a stark choice: speed to Custer's aid or wait for the pack train's ammunition. His 120 men, fresh but lightly supplied with 50 rounds each, could move swiftly, covering 3 miles in 20 minutes at a trot. The pack train, however, trailed 4 miles back, moving at 3 miles per hour with 140 mules and 50 guards. Custer's order to bring the packs implied a need for sustained combat, but Martin's urgency suggested immediate action. Benteen, pacing beside his horse, his saber clinking, weighed the contradiction. Evan S. Connell writes, Benteen saw the tasks as mutually exclusive, forcing a gamble with lives at stake. The 90-degree heat, drying the creek beds, and the 25 miles already marched that day pressed Benteen to prioritize mobility. His decision would shape the fate of the 7th Cavalry's 650 soldiers. Benteen, his voice firm, declared he would not wait for the packs. Standing on the sun-baked trail, his right hand resting on his Colt revolver, he announced, "If I am going to be of service to him, I had better not wait." The 120 troopers, their horses snorting, prepared to move. Historian John S. Gray defends Benteen, stating, "His choice to prioritize speed was logical, given the gunfire 2 miles away and Custer's unknown plight. Benteen's column, with 360 total personnel, including officers, could reinforce Reno's 170 surviving men or reach Custer's 225, but the pack train's delay estimated at 80 minutes to arrive tipped the scales." Benteen's resolve reflected his veteran instincts, honed in the Civil War, but the 1,500 warriors awaiting them loomed as an unyielding foe. Benteen sent Martin back to Captain McDougal with orders to hasten the pack train. Martin, remounting his exhausted horse, saluted and rode east, covering the 4 miles to the 140-mule convoy. Benteen's directive aimed to close the gap, as the pack train carried 24,000 rounds of .45 -70 ammunition and 2,000 pounds of rations. Utley notes, Benteen's order to Martin was a practical move, but the mule's slow pace doomed it to irrelevance. Martin's ride, at 10 miles per hour, took 24 minutes, leaving Benteen's column to advance without immediate support. The 50 guards with the pack train, armed with 80 rounds each, were critical for securing the supplies, but their absence weakened Benteen's force. The decision underscored the logistical strain facing the 7th Cavalry, as 1,500 native warriors dominated the battlefield. Benteen's column trotted downstream, covering 1 mile in 8 minutes along Reno Creek. His 120 men, riding in 2 columns, kicked up dust under the blazing sun, their carbines slung across their backs. Benteen, at the front, his reins in his left hand, scanned the horizon for signs of Reno or Custer. The gunfire, now 1.5 miles away, grew sharper, with 800 warriors engaging Reno's dwindling force. Connell writes, Benteen's trot was a compromise, preserving his horses while closing the distance. The 120 horses, each carrying 200 pounds, showed signs of strain after 25 miles of marching. Benteen's pace, 8 miles per hour, aimed to balance speed and endurance, as the village's 7,000 inhabitants, including 2,000 fighters, posed a formidable threat. The column reached the point where Reno and Custer had split earlier that day, a fork in the trail 2 miles from the village. Benteen, halting his horse, surveyed the landscape, his right hand shielding his eyes. He remarked that they faced the horns of a dilemma, a phrase reflecting the uncertainty of choosing between Reno's 210 men, now retreating, or Custer's 225, fighting unseen. Philbrick states, Benteen's pause at the fork was a moment of reckoning as the 7th Division sowed chaos. The terrain, with low ridges and dry washes, hid the battle's scope, but gunfire 800 shots per minute from warriors' repeaters echoed clearly. Benteen's 120 men, with 6,000 rounds total, stood at a crossroads, their next move critical to the 650-man regiment's survival. Benteen consulted his officers, standing in a tight circle beside their horses. Weir, Godfrey, and Yates, their tunics unbuttoned, debated briefly under the 90-degree heat. Benteen, his saber at his side, decided to veer left toward the Little Bighorn River, while ordering the rest of the column right. The split, covering 500 yards, aimed to locate Reno's force, now 1 mile away with 170 survivors. Ambrose notes, Benteen's decision to divide his approach was bold but risky, given the 1,500 warriors nearby. Company H, with 40 men, led the leftward move, while Companies D and K, totaling 80, swung right. The maneuver, executed in 5 minutes, reflected Benteen's attempt to cover more ground, but it stretched his 120-man force thin against a vast enemy. Benteen's men, now split, spotted fighting in the valley 1 mile away and figures on the bluffs ahead. From 800 yards, the 120 troopers, their eyes straining, could not discern if the figures were Custer's 225 men, Reno's 170, or the 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Benteen, riding at the head of Company H, tightened his grip on his reins, his horse stepping over sagebrush. The Valley Battle, with 800 warriors firing 1,000 rounds per minute, sent dust clouds rising, while the bluffs, 200 feet high, held unknown threats. Utley writes, Benteen's uncertainty at this moment mirrored the 7th's broader disarray. The 120 men, with 50 rounds each, pressed forward. Their fate tied to the 7,000-person village below where native families fought for their homeland. Captain Frederick Benteen, his horse galloping across the sun-scorched bluffs, led his 120 men of companies H, D, and K toward the Little Bighorn on the 25th of June, 1875. His blue tunic, unbuttoned in the 90-degree heat, flapped as he gripped his reins in his left hand. From 500 yards away, he spotted Major Marcus Reno, his face pale and dust-streaked, standing atop a bluff with his saber in his right hand, his horse tethered to a scrubby bush. Reno, commanding 170 survivors of his original 210-man force, shouted for Benteen to halt and help, claiming he had lost half his men in a brutal valley fight against 800 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick describes Reno's plea as a cry of desperation from a commander overwhelmed by defeat. The encounter, just 2 miles from the 7,000-person native village, marked a turning point, as Benteen's fresh troops faced a shattered ally and an unseen enemy. Benteen, dismounting with a creak of leather, pulled Custer's final note from his pocket and handed it to Reno. The note, scrawled by Adjutant William Cook, urged Benteen to bring the pack train's 24,000 rounds of ammunition and join Custer's 225 men, fighting 3 miles north. Reno, his hands trembling, read the note but admitted he had no idea where Custer was. His 170 men, scattered across the 200-foot-hig H bluffs, were low on ammunition, with each trooper carrying fewer than 20 rounds for their Springfield carbines. Historian Robert M. Utley notes, Reno's ignorance of Custer's position reflected the 7th Cavalry's catastrophic lack of coordination. The 800 warriors in the valley, armed with 200 repeating rifles and 600 bows, had driven Reno's force into chaos, killing 40 men in 20 minutes. Benteen's arrival, with 120 fresh troops, offered hope. But Reno's disarray cast a grim shadow. Benteen, his boots crunching on the dry grass, urged Reno to link up with Custer's command as soon as possible. Standing beside his horse, its ears twitching at the distant gunfire, Benteen argued that his 120 men, each with 50 rounds, could move swiftly to reinforce Custer's 225 soldiers, now facing 1,500 warriors. Reno, however, his voice hoarse, insisted on waiting for the pack train 4 miles away with 140 mules and 50 guards. His 170 survivors, including 35 wounded, had expended 8,000 rounds in the valley fight, leaving them critically short. Historian Evan S. Connell writes, Reno's fixation on ammunition paralyzed any effort to aid Custer, prioritizing survival over strategy. The 90-degree heat and the 25 miles march that day weighed on Reno's men, but Benteen's proposal, backed by his 360 total personnel, offered a chance to shift the battle's tide. Reno, as the ranking officer, overruled Benteen's plan. His kepi askew, he stood firm on the bluff, his right hand clutching his revolver. His decision to wait for the pack train, estimated to arrive in 80 minutes, halted any immediate move to support Custer's 225 men, now 3 miles away. The 170 survivors, sprawled across a 300-yard perimeter, faced 800 warriors still active in the valley below. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose argues, Reno's choice to dig in rather than march was a death knell for Custer's command. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 women and children, fueled the warriors' resolve as they fought to protect their families. Reno's order, binding Benteen's 120 men to a defensive role, shifted the 7th Cavalry's fate, leaving 650 total soldiers fragmented across the battlefield. Benteen, now subordinate, complied with Reno's command. He turned to Captain Thomas Weir and Lieutenant William Godfrey, standing nearby with their horses' reins in hand, and ordered them to deploy skirmish lines. Company D, with 40 men, spread out along a 200-yard front, while Company K, also 40 strong, took position on a low ridge. Benteen's Company H, with 40 troopers, anchored the center, each man kneeling with his carbine ready. The 120 men, facing 800 warriors 500 yards away, formed a thin defensive line atop the bluffs. Philbrick notes, Benteen's swift organization of skirmish lines stabilized Reno's crumbling force. The 170 survivors, including 35 Crow Scouts, relied on Benteen's 6.000 rounds to hold the position, as the pack train's 24,000 rounds remained 4 miles distant. The lines, set in 5 minutes, braced for an assault that could overwhelm the 350 total troops. Reno's survivors, staggering up the 200-foot bluffs, brought tales of horror from the valley. The 170 men, down from 210, had faced 800 warriors in a 20-minute clash, losing 40 killed and 35 wounded. Troopers, their uniforms torn, collapsed beside their horses, some clutching bloodied bandanas. The retreat, covering 1 mile under fire, saw 20 men cut down by arrows and bullets. Historian John S. Gray calculates, Reno's force lost 30% of its strength in the valley, a staggering blow. The 800 warriors, using 200 Henry and Winchester rifles, fired 1,000 rounds per minute, overwhelming Reno's 8,000-round expenditure. The survivors, now mixed with Benteen's 120 men, formed a 500-yard defensive perimeter, their 10,000 total rounds a fragile buffer against the 1,500 warriors protecting their 7-person village. From the bluffs, Benteen's and Reno's men watched 800 warriors move downstream, their war cries carrying across the valley. Another 700, including women, remained behind, mutilating the 40 fallen troopers with knives and clubs. The sight, 500 yards below, chilled the 350 soldiers, who gripped their carbines tighter. Connell writes, the warriors' ferocity was a testament to their defense of home and kin. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 women and children, drove the warriors' resolve, as they protected families from the 650-man 7th Cavalry. The 170 survivors, their faces etched with fear, saw the cost of Reno's failed charge, while Benteen's 120 men, still fresh, braced for the next move atop the bluffs. Distinct volleys, sharp and rhythmic, echoed from 3 miles downstream, likely from Custer's 225 men. Lieutenant Charles Varnum, his binoculars in hand, stood beside his horse and noted the sound, estimating 500 rounds fired in 2 minutes. Lieutenant William Godfrey, half-deaf from prior battles, also heard the heavy firing. His kepi tilted as he listened. The 350 troops on the bluffs, including 170 of Reno's men, recognized the gunfire as Custer's, facing 1,500 warriors. Utley states, the volleys were a desperate signal, yet no officer acted. The 800 warriors in the valley, now shifting north, suggested Custer's fight was escalating. The 120 men under Benteen, with 50 rounds each, could have marched 3 miles in 20 minutes, but Reno's orders held them fast. Despite the gunfire, the 350 troops, including 6 companies, did not move toward Custer. Reno's 170 men, with 20 rounds each, were too battered, having lost 40 killed and 35 wounded. Benteen's 120, with 6,000 rounds, remained under Reno's command, their skirmish lines facing 800 warriors 500 yards away. Ambrose notes, the failure to march to the guns was a tragic collapse of initiative. The 1,500 warriors, including 200 with repeating rifles, dominated the battlefield, their 7,000-person village fueling their fight. The 650-man 7th Cavalry, split into 3 groups, lacked unity, as Reno's 200-foot Hig H position became a fortress of inaction, 3 miles from Custer's last stand. Reno failed to organize a strong defense or send scouts to assess the situation. His 170 men, spread across a 500-yard perimeter, lacked rifle pits or barricades, relying on sparse grass for cover. No reconnaissance parties, which could have covered 1 mile in 10 minutes, were dispatched to locate Custer's 225 men or the 1,500 warriors. Philbrick argues Reno's inaction left his command blind, a fatal flaw in a fluid battle. The 350 troops, including Benteen's 120, faced 800 warriors in the valley, with 700 more downstream. The pack train, 4 miles away with 24,000 rounds, remained out of reach, leaving the 10,000 rounds on hand as the only defense. Reno's failure, atop the bluffs, sealed the 7th Cavalry's fractured fate. Major Marcus Reno, his blue tunic stained with sweat and blood, committed a grave error on the 25th of June, 1875, as he abandoned his post atop the Little Bighorn bluffs. With his revolver in his right hand and his horse tethered nearby, Reno led 12 troopers down a steep 200-foot slope to search for the body of his aide, Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson. The group, moving 500 yards through sagebrush and rocky outcrops, left the 350-man command leaderless for 30 minutes. Reno's force, reduced to 170 survivors from 210 after a brutal valley fight against 800 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, was already fragile, with only 20 rounds per man. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick condemns this act, stating, "Reno's departure to recover Hodgson's body was an unforgivable lapse, abandoning his men at a critical hour. The 120 men under Captain Frederick Benteen, holding skirmish lines against 800 warriors 500 yards away, were left without direction as the 7,000-person native village drove the battle's ferocity. Reno's 30-minute absence, covering 1 mile round trip, saw him locate Hodgson's body among the 40 fallen troopers in the valley. Kneeling beside the corpse, Reno retrieved personal items: a watch, a ring, while his 12-man escort, carbines at the ready, scanned for the 700 warriors still looting the dead. The valley, 500 yards below the bluffs, was a scene of horror, with mutilated bodies scattered across 200 yards. Historian Evan S. Connell notes, Reno's focus on Hodgson's remains, while 350 men awaited orders, revealed a commander unmoored by the battle's chaos. The 170 survivors, including 35 wounded, relied on Benteen's 120 fresh troops, who held a 500-yard perimeter with 6,000 rounds. Reno's detour, in the 90-degree heat, cost precious time as Custer's 225 men fought 3 miles north against 1,500 warriors, their fate sealed by the 7th Cavalry's disarray. Upon returning to the bluffs, Reno, his face ashen, appointed Lieutenant Luther Hare as his adjutant. Standing beside his horse, its reins in his left hand, Reno ordered Hare to ride 4 miles east to hasten the pack train, carrying 24,000 rounds of ammunition and 140 mules. Hare, a wiry Texan with a kepi tilted back, mounted his horse and galloped off, covering the distance in 24 minutes at 10 miles per hour. The pack train, guarded by 50 men under Captain Thomas McDougall, was critical, as Reno's 170 men had only 3,400 rounds left after expending 8,000 in the valley. Historian Robert M. Utley argues, Reno's belated order to Hare was a desperate attempt to reclaim control, but it came too late to alter the battle's course. The 350 troops, including Benteen's 120, faced 800 warriors in the valley, with 700 more downstream, as the 7,000-person village fueled the native resolve. Captain Thomas Weir, commanding Company D, grew restless as gunfire from Custer's 225 men, 3 miles north, faded. Standing on the bluff, his tall frame leaning forward, Weir gripped his saber in his right hand, his horse pawing the ground. He turned to Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly and First Sergeant Michael Martin, their uniforms dust-caked, and asked if they would advance to Custer's aid, even without the other 5 companies. The 40 men of Company D, each with 50 rounds, were fresh compared to Reno's 170, who had lost 40 killed and 35 wounded. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose notes, Weir's impatience reflected a soldier's instinct to march to the guns, a duty Reno ignored. The 800 warriors, armed with 200 repeating rifles, fired 1,000 rounds per minute below, while 1,500 total warriors dominated the battlefield, protecting their 2,000 women and children. Weir confronted Reno, sparking a heated argument atop the bluffs. Reno, his revolver holstered, stood firm, his dislike for Weir evident in his clenched jaw. Weir, his voice rising, demanded action, pointing to the 500 rounds per minute echoing from Custer's position. Their feud, rooted in prior clashes, boiled over as Reno refused to move, citing his 170 men's need for the pack train's 24,000 rounds, still 80 minutes away. Connell writes, "The Reno-Weir dispute, fueled by personal animosity, paralyzed the command at a moment of crisis. The 350 troops, including Benteen's 120, held a 500-yard perimeter, their 10,000 rounds dwindling against 800 warriors 500 yards away. Weir's plea, backed by his 40-man company, fell on deaf ears, as Reno's authority bound the 7th Cavalry to inaction. Defiant, Weir acted alone. He mounted his bay horse, spurs glinting, and rode north along the 200-foot bluffs, covering 1 mile in 10 minutes. His 40-man Company D, left behind, watched as Weir's lone figure vanished over a rise, his saber at his side. The move, bold but reckless, aimed to locate Custer's 225 men, now facing 1,500 warriors. Philbrick states, "Weir's solo ride was a gesture of courage, but it exposed the 7th E's fractured leadership. The 170 survivors, with 20 rounds each, and Benteen's 120 with 50 rounds, remained under Reno's orders, facing 800 warriors in the valley. Weir's action, driven by duty, set a dangerous precedent as the 650-man regiment struggled against the 7,000-person village's defenders. Lieutenant Edgerly, believing Weir had Reno's permission, rallied Company D. Standing beside his horse, his kepi in hand, Edgerly ordered his 40 troopers to mount, their carbines slung across their backs. The company, covering 200 yards in 2 minutes, followed Weir north, their hoofbeats echoing across the bluffs. Edgerly's assumption, based on Weir's departure, reflected the confusion gripping the 350-man command. Utley notes, Edgerly's advance, though unauthorized, showed the initiative Reno lacked. The 40 men, with 2,000 rounds total, moved 1 mile in 10 minutes, unaware that 500 warriors, including 200 with repeaters, awaited. The 170 survivors and Benteen's 120, still on the bluffs, faced 800 warriors, as the pack train's 24,000 rounds remained 4 miles away. At Weir Point, a 300-foot Hig H promontory, Weir deployed Company D in a skirmish line across 200 yards. Dismounting, his binoculars in his left hand, Weir scanned the horizon 2 miles north, initially mistaking 500 distant figures for Custer's 225 men. His 40 troopers, kneeling in the grass, held their carbines ready, each with 50 rounds. The position, 1 mile from Reno's 350 men, offered a clear view of the 7,000-person village below, where 800 warriors moved. Ambrose writes, Weir's hope of finding Custer alive drove his advance, but it exposed his men to grave danger. The 1,500 warriors, with 1,000 rounds per minute from repeaters, dominated the battlefield, their resolve rooted in protecting 2,000 women and children. Sergeant James Flanagan, an Irish-born Civil War veteran, corrected Weir's error. Handing Weir his binoculars, Flanagan, his kepi low, pointed to the 500 figures, identifying them as Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, not Custer's men. The 40 troopers, spread across 200 yards, tensed as the truth sank in. Custer's 225 men were likely lost. 2 miles away. Connell states, Flanagan's sharp eye saved Company D from a reckless charge into oblivion. The 1,500 warriors, including 200 with Henry rifles, were closing in, their war cries audible 500 yards away. Weir's 40 men, with 2,000 rounds, held Weir Point, 1 mile from Reno's 350, as the 7,000-person village fueled the native fight. Benteen, seeing Company D's advance, assumed an order to move. Standing on the bluffs, his right hand on his saber, he ordered Companies H, K, and M 120 men totalto mount and ride north. The 120 troopers, covering 1 mile in 10 minutes, reached Weir Point, their 6,000 rounds bolstering Weir's 40. Benteen's horse, lathered with sweat, snorted as he surveyed the 200-yard skirmish line. Philbrick notes, Benteen's advance, though based on a misunderstanding, briefly unified the command's purpose. The 160 men at Weir Point, facing 1,500 warriors 500 yards away, held a precarious position as Reno's 170 survivors, with 3,400 rounds, remained 1 mile south, guarding the 650-man 7th Cavalry's last stand. Captain Thomas McDougall, his blue tunic soaked with sweat, arrived at the Little Bighorn Bluffs on the 25th of June, 1875, leading the pack train with Lieutenant James Matthey. His 140 mules, laden with 24,000 rounds of .45-70 ammunition and 2,000 pounds of rations, trudged 4 miles from Reno Creek under the guard of 50 troopers. McDougall, gripping his reins in his left hand, dismounted his horse and surveyed the 350-man command, now a patchwork of Major Marcus Reno's 170 survivors and Captain Frederick Benteen's 120 fresh troops. Without orders from Reno, McDougall deployed his 50 men in a skirmish line across 200 yards, bolstering the defense against 800 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors 500 yards below. Historian Robert M. Utley praises this move, stating, McDougall's initiative filled a void left by Reno's inaction, securing the vital supplies. The pack train's arrival, after a 90-minute march at 3 miles per hour, was a lifeline for the 7th Cavalry's 650 soldiers, facing a 7,000-person native village. Reno, standing atop the 200-foot bluff with his revolver holstered, finally acted by sending Lieutenant Luther Hare to Captain Thomas Weir at Weir Point, 1 mile north. Hare, his kepi low and his horse lathered, carried orders to establish contact with General George Custer's 225 men, believed to be fighting 2 miles away. Hare's ride, covering 1 mile in 10 minutes at 6 miles per hour, aimed to bridge the gap between Reno's 350 troops and Custer's isolated command. The 40 men of Company D under Weir, with 2,000 rounds, held a 200-yard skirmish line against 1,500 warriors. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick calls Reno's order a belated gesture, too late to save Custer. The 170 survivors, with 3,400 rounds, and Benteen's 120, with 6,000 rounds, faced 800 warriors in the valley, as the 24,000 rounds from the pack train offered hope for a sustained defense. Reno ordered a trumpeter to sound the halt, his voice sharp as he stood beside his horse, its reins in his right hand. The signal, meant to recall Benteen's 120 men from Weir Point, echoed across the bluffs. But Benteen, his saber at his side, ignored it. Leading companies H, K, and M 120 troopers with 6,000 rounds, Benteen pressed to Weir Point, joining Weir's 40 men. His horse, snorting in the 90-degree heat, stepped over sagebrush as he deployed his force across 300 yards. Historian Evan S. Connell notes, Benteen's defiance of Reno's halt showed his commitment to action, however misguided. The 160 men at Weir Point, facing 1,500 warriors 500 yards away, held a precarious line, while Reno's 170 survivors, with 35 wounded, remained 1 mile south, guarding the 650-man 7th Cavalry's fragile position against a 2,000 warrior force. Reno, his face etched with strain, mobilized his 170 survivors, the pack train, and 35 wounded. Standing on the bluff, his kepi askew, he ordered 6 soldiers to carry each injured man in blankets, a slow process covering 200 yards in 10 minutes. The 170 men, each with 20 rounds, moved with the 140 mules and 50 pack train guards, their 24,000 rounds a critical asset. The wounded, numbering 35 from a 210-man force that lost 40 killed, slowed the march as each blanket team moved at 2 miles per hour. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose argues, Reno's effort to move his command was necessary but chaotic, reflecting his struggle to regain control. The 350 troops, including Benteen's 120 at Weir Point, faced 800 warriors in the valley and 700 downstream, as the 7,000-person native village fueled the battle's intensity. From Weir Point, Benteen, his binoculars in his left hand, observed 1,500 warriors advancing 500 yards away, their war cries chilling the 160 men. The 300-foot Hig H position, exposed to 200 repeating rifles firing 1,000 rounds per minute, was indefensible. Benteen, his horse pawing the ground, decided to retreat to Reno's 170-man position 1 mile south. Historian John S. Gray states, Benteen's assessment of Weir Point's weakness was tactically sound, prioritizing survival. The 160 men, with 8,000 rounds, faced 1,500 warriors, including 800 shifting from the valley. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 women and children, drove the warriors' resolve, as Benteen's 120 troopers, covering 1 mile in 10 minutes, prepared to rejoin the 350-man command against overwhelming odds. Benteen persuaded Reno to abandon Weir Point and return to the original bluff position 1 mile south. Standing beside Reno, his right hand on his saber, Benteen argued the 200-foot bluffs offered better cover against 1,500 warriors. Reno, his uniform torn, nodded, his authority eroded by 40 killed and 35 wounded in his 210-man force. The retreat, covering 1 mile in 12 minutes, left Companies D and M 80 men under Captains Samuel French and Winfield Edgerly exposed at Weir Point. Philbrick writes, Benteen's influence over Reno marked his de facto leadership, but it stranded Weir's men. The 350 troops, with 10,000 rounds, regrouped on the bluffs, facing 800 warriors 500 yards away, as the 24,000-round pack train bolstered their stand. As Benteen and Weir withdrew south, Companies D and M, with 80 men, remained at Weir Point without orders. French, his kepi low, and Edgerly, his revolver in hand, held a 200-yard skirmish line, unaware of the retreat. The 80 troopers, with 4,000 rounds, faced 1,500 warriors 300 yards away, their 200 repeaters firing 1,000 rounds per minute. Connell notes, the abandonment of Companies D and M was a tragic oversight, exposing them to annihilation. The 40 men of Company D, under Weir's earlier command, and Company M's 40, under French, stood isolated, 1 mile from Reno's 350-man position. The 7,000-person village with 2,000 fighters pressed the attack as the 650-man 7th Cavalry's cohesion crumbled. McDougal, watching the chaos from the bluffs, approached Benteen, his horse tethered nearby. His voice urgent, McDougal, his right hand on his carbine, urged Benteen, the senior captain, to take command, warning that the 350 troops needed leadership to avoid collapse. The 170 survivors with 3,400 rounds and Benteen's 120 with 6,000 rounds faced 800 warriors 500 yards away with 700 more downstream. Utley states, McDougal's plea to Benteen was a turning point, as Reno's failures demanded a new leader. The 50-pack train guards, with 4,000 rounds, reinforced the 200-foot bluff position as the 24,000 rounds offered a lifeline against the 1,500 warrior force defending their 7,000-person village. Benteen, with a wry smile, accepted the role. Standing beside his horse, his saber at his side, he assumed de facto command of the 350 troops, including Reno's 170 and his own 120. His 6 companies, spread across a 500-yard perimeter, faced 1,500 warriors, including 200 with repeating rifles. Ambrose argues, Benteen's leadership, though late, saved the 7th Cavalry from total destruction. The 10,000 rounds on hand plus the pack train's 24,000 gave the 350 men a fighting chance, as the 40 killed and 35 wounded in Reno's force underscored the battle's toll. Benteen's resolve, rooted in his Civil War experience, rallied the 650-man regiment's remnants against the 7,000-person native village's defenders. French and Edgerly, realizing their 80 men were stranded at Weir Point, ordered a desperate retreat. Mounting their horses, their carbines slung, they led Companies D and M south, covering 1 mile in 10 minutes under pursuit by 1,500 warriors. Trooper Vincent Charlie, a Swiss-born soldier, was shot from his horse 500 yards from safety, his body abandoned as warriors killed him with a broken guidon shaft. The 80 troopers, with 4,000 rounds, fled to the 350-man bluff position, their hoofbeats drowned by 1,000 rounds per minute from 200 repeaters. Philbrick writes, Charlie's death was a grim symbol of the 7th's disintegration, as French and Edgerly escaped by inches. The 170 survivors, with 3,400 rounds, and Benteen's 120, with 6,000, braced for the next assault, as the 7,000-person village's 2,000 warriors pressed their advantage. Lieutenant William Godfrey, his blue kepi low and his saber at his side, took command of Company K on the 25th of June, 1875, as the 7th Cavalry's position on the Little Bighorn Bluffs teetered on collapse. With 30 men, Godfrey organized a rearguard action to cover the chaotic retreat of Companies D and M, who fled 1 mile south from Weir Point under pursuit by 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Standing beside his horse, its reins in his left hand, Godfrey drew on his experience from the Ouachita and Yellowstone campaigns, where he led 40 men through similar rearguards with no losses. Historian Robert M. Utley praises Godfrey's resolve, stating, "His steady leadership in the face of 800 warriors saved Company K from annihilation." The 350-man command, including Major Marcus Reno's 170 survivors and Captain Frederick Benteen's 120 troops, relied on Godfrey's 30 men to hold back the 7,000-person native village's defenders, who fired 1,000 rounds per minute from 200 repeating rifles. Godfrey, his face grim under the 90-degree heat, enlisted Lieutenant Luther Hare to assist. Hare, a wiry Texan with a revolver in his right hand, rallied the 30 troopers of Company K, who dismounted and sent their horses back 200 yards to the main position. Godfrey divided his force into 2 platoons of 15 men each, spreading them across a 100-yard line on the bluffs. Each trooper, kneeling in the sparse grass, carried 50 rounds for their Springfield carbines, totaling 1,500 rounds. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick notes, Godfrey's tactical discipline, honed in prior campaigns, turned 30 men into a formidable barrier against 1,500 warriors. The 800 warriors in the valley, 500 yards below, pressed the attack, while 700 more moved downstream, threatening the 650-man 7th Cavalry's survival. Godfrey's rearguard, covering 1 mile, aimed to buy time for the 350 troops to fortify their 500-yard perimeter. Godfrey's platoons alternated firing and retreating, a maneuver executed with precision under heavy fire. One platoon of 15 men fired 150 rounds per minute, while the other fell back 50 yards, reloading their 50-round carbines. The 30 troopers, facing 800 warriors with 200 Henry and Winchester rifles, endured 1,000 incoming rounds per minute across a 200-yard front. Godfrey, standing tall, shouted orders as arrows and bullets whizzed past, his horse tethered 100 yards back. Historian Evan S. Connell writes, Godfrey's rearguard was a masterclass in discipline, holding off a force 50 times their size. The 350-man command, with 10,000 rounds bolstered by the pack train's 24,000, depended on Godfrey's 1,500 rounds to delay the 1,500 warriors who fought to protect their 2,000 women and children in the 7,000-person village. As the 30 men retreated, panic threatened to unravel their formation. Under pressure from 800 warriors 200 yards away, troopers began to cluster, their 50-round carbines firing erratically. Godfrey, his saber raised, and Hare, his revolver drawn, moved among the men, shouting threats to restore order. The 15-man platoons, now 50 yards apart, maintained their alternating retreat, covering 1 mile in 15 minutes. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose argues, Godfrey and Hare's iron will prevent a rout, saving 30 lives. The 1,500 warriors, including 200 with repeaters, pressed closer, their war cries echoing across the 200-foot bluffs. The 350 troops, including Reno's 170, with 3,400 rounds, watched from 500 yards away as Godfrey's 30 men faced the brunt of the 7,000-person village's defenders. Godfrey's company sprinted the final 100 yards to the 350-man defensive perimeter, reaching safety without a single casualty. The 30 troopers, their uniforms torn, collapsed beside their horses, each still clutching 30 rounds. Their 1-mile retreat, under fire from 1,000 rounds per minute, was a testament to Godfrey's leadership. Utley states, Godfrey's flawless rearguard bought the 7th Cavalry precious minutes to regroup. The 350 troops, spread across a 500-yard line, now included Reno's 170, Benteen's 120, and McDougal's 50 pack train guards with 34,000 total rounds. The 800 warriors, 500 yards below and 700 downstream, continued their assault, driven by the 7,000-person village's resolve. Godfrey's 30 men, though exhausted, strengthened the 650-man regiment's fragile hold against overwhelming odds. The Reno-Benteen position, perched on 200-foot bluffs, offered little natural cover. The 350 troops used saddles, dead horses, and 140 grain bags from the pack train to build makeshift barriers across a 500-yard perimeter. Each trooper, with 50 rounds, and the 50 pack train guards, with 80 rounds, faced 1,500 warriors 500 yards away. The 170 survivors of Reno's 210-man force, having lost 40 killed and 35 wounded, crouched behind 200 saddles and 20 dead animals. Philbrick notes, the lack of cover exposed the 7th's vulnerability as 1,500 warriors exploited every weakness. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 fighters, pressed the attack, their 200 repeating rifles firing 1,000 rounds per minute. The 350 troops, under Benteen's command, braced for a prolonged siege, their survival hinging on 34,000 rounds. With only 3 spades among the 350 troops, digging fortifications was nearly impossible. The 170 survivors, 120 fresh troops, and 50 pack train guards scraped shallow rifle pits with knives and tin cups, covering 500 yards in the 90-degree heat. Each pit, 2 feet deep, sheltered 2 men, totaling 175 positions. Connell writes, the scarcity of tools underscored the 7th's desperation, as 1,500 warriors circled. The 800 warriors in the valley, 500 yards away, fired 1,000 rounds per minute, while 700 downstream targeted Custer's 225 men, now lost. The 34,000 rounds, including 24,000 from the pack train, were the 350 troops' lifeline, as the 7,000-person village's 2,000 fighters showed no sign of relenting. The lack of spades, a logistical oversight, left the 650-man regiment exposed. By nightfall on the 25th of June, 1875, the 350 troops had suffered 12 killed and 21 wounded, bringing the day's total to 52 dead and 56 wounded from the original 650-man regiment. The 170 survivors of Reno's force, with 40 killed earlier, bore the brunt, while Benteen's 120 and McDougal's 50 lost 12 in the bluff defense. The 33 casualties, scattered across a 500-yard perimeter, lay among 200 saddles and 20 dead horses. Ambrose states, the nightfall toll revealed the battle's ferocity, as 1,500 warriors tested the 7th's resolve. The 800 warriors, 500 yards below, paused, their 7,000-person village glowing with campfires. The 350 troops, with 34,000 rounds, held their ground. Their losses a stark reminder of the 2,000 warrior forces' dominance. Overnight, all companies except Benteen's Company H dug rifle pits to strengthen the 500-yard perimeter. The 170 survivors, 80 men from Companies D, K, and M, and 50 pack train guards used 3 spades and 300 knives to create 150 pits, each 2 feet deep. Benteen's 40-man Company H, with 2,000 rounds, stood watch, their 50-round carbines ready. Gray notes, The overnight fortifications, though meager, gave the 7th a fighting chance against 1,500 warriors. The 800 warriors in the valley, 500 yards away, prepared for dawn, while 700 downstream likely finished Custer's 225 men. The 34,000 rounds, including 24,000 from the pack train, bolstered the 350 troops, as the 7,000-person village's 2,000 fighters planned their next assault. In the valley, 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors celebrated their victory, their chants echoing through the night. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 women and children, glowed with 1,000 campfires, as 800 warriors recounted their triumph over Reno's 210-man force, which lost 40 killed. The 200 repeating rifles, firing 1,000 rounds per minute, had decimated the 7th Cavalry's valley attack, while 700 warriors likely overwhelmed Custer's 225 men. Philbrick writes, "The celebration was a defiant assertion of native strength, defending home against 650 invaders. The 350 troops 500 yards above heard the chants, their 34,000 rounds a slim shield against the 1,500 warriors, whose resolve to protect their 7,000-person village burned as fiercely as their fires. As dawn broke on the 26th of June, 1875, the 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors resumed their assault on the 350 surviving troops of the 7th Cavalry entrenched on the 200-foot bluffs above the Little Bighorn. The warriors, their faces painted with red and black, charged across 500 yards, firing 1,000 rounds per minute from 200 Henry and Winchester repeating rifles. Captain Frederick Benteen, his blue tunic unbuttoned and his saber at his side, directed the 120 men of companies H, D, and K, while Major Marcus Reno's 170 survivors, down from 210, crouched in shallow rifle pits. The 50-pack train guards, led by Captain Thomas McDougall, bolstered the 500-yard perimeter, their 34,000 rounds a lifeline against the 800 warriors in the valley below. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick writes, "The renewed attack tested the 7th resolve, as the Sioux and Cheyenne fought with unrelenting fury to protect their 7,000-person village. The 350 troops, with 150 rifle pits and 200 saddles for cover, faced a relentless onslaught. Their 52 dead and 56 wounded a grim tally of the battle's toll. Late that afternoon, the warriors employed a cunning tactic, setting fire to the grass along the Little Bighorn River, 500 yards from the bluffs. The flames, spreading across 1,000 yards, created a thick smoke screen, masking the movements of 1,500 warriors, including 200 with repeaters. Benteen, standing beside his horse with binoculars in his left hand, watched the fire obscure the valley where 800 warriors maneuvered. The 350 troops, their 34,000 rounds dwindling to 30,000 after a day's fighting, braced for a hidden assault. Historian Evan S. Connell notes, "The grass fire was a Sioux and Cheyenne hallmark, concealing their strategy while unnerving the 7th EAF's defenders. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 women and children, fueled the warriors' determination. As the 650-man regiment's survivors, now 350, held a fragile line against a force 3 times their number. As the afternoon waned, the 350 troops, their faces etched with fatigue, observed the 7,000-person native village begin to move upstream along the Little Bighorn, 2 miles away. The 1,500 warriors, including 800 in the valley and 700 downstream, escorted 2,000 women and children and 5,000 horses, their travois stretching 1 mile. Reno, his kepi askew and revolver in his right hand, stood among his 170 survivors, watching the exodus. The 120 men under Benteen, with 6,000 rounds, and 50 pack train guards, with 4,000 rounds, held their 500-yard perimeter, their 150 rifle pits offering scant protection. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose states, "The village's withdrawal was a strategic retreat, not a surrender, preserving native strength. The 350 troops, down from 650, saw the move as a reprieve, but the 500 warriors' departure left the fate of Custer's 225 men, 3 miles north, a haunting mystery. That night, the 350 survivors, under Benteen's command, watered their 300 horses at a spring 200 yards from the bluffs. The task, completed in 30 minutes under cover of darkness, was critical, as each horse had gone 24 hours without water in 90-degree heat. Benteen, his boots crunching on the dry grass, oversaw the effort, while Reno's 170 men, with 3,400 rounds, guarded the 500-yard perimeter. The 50-pack train guards, with 4,000 rounds, secured 140 mules carrying 20,000 remaining rounds. During this respite, survivors like Lieutenant Charles DeRudio, who had hidden in the valley's timber for 24 hours after Reno's retreat, rejoined the command. Philbrick writes, DeRudio's survival, one of 10 stragglers, underscored the chaos of Reno's valley fight where 40 were killed. The 350 troops, bolstered by 34,000 rounds, prepared for another day, unaware of Custer's fate against the 7,000-person village's defenders. The battle ended late on the 26th of June, leaving the 350 survivors battered but intact, thanks to Benteen's leadership. The 170 men of Reno's command, down from 210, had lost 40 killed and 35 wounded, while Benteen's 120 and McDougall's 50 suffered 12 killed and 21 wounded. The 500-yard perimeter, fortified with 150 rifle pits and 200 saddles, held against 1,500 warriors who fired 1,000 rounds per minute from 200 repeaters. Historian John S. Gray argues, Benteen's defensive stand, leveraging 34,000 rounds, preserved the 7th from total destruction. The 7,000-person village, with 2,000 fighters, achieved a decisive victory, their 800 warriors in the valley outmatching the 650-man regiment's fractured efforts. The 350 survivors, their 300 horses exhausted, mourned 265 dead, including Custer's 225, as the native triumph echoed across the plains. General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon crossed the Yellowstone River on the 24th of June, 1875, with 400 men, including 4 cavalry companies, 5 infantry companies, a Gatling gun detachment, and 10 Crow scouts. Terry, his gray beard visible under his kepi, rode at the head, his right hand on his saber. The force, moving 10 miles per day, carried 20,000 rounds and 5,000 pounds of rations. Their goal was to link with Custer's 650-man 7th Cavalry, unaware of the disaster 30 miles south. Connell notes, Terry's advance, slowed by rugged terrain, was a race against time he didn't know he was running. The 400 men, with 300 horses, camped near Tulloch's Creek, 15 miles from the Little Bighorn, as the 1,500 warriors dominated the battlefield, protecting their 7,000-person village. Hindered by a guide unfamiliar with the terrain, Terry's 400-man column moved slowly, covering 10 miles on the 25th of June. The guide, a civilian scout with a rifle slung across his back, led the 4 cavalry and 5 infantry companies astray, delaying their arrival at the Bighorn-Little Bighorn confluence. By midnight on the 26th of June, the force halted 1.5 miles north of their objective, with 300 horses and 20,000 rounds. Utley writes, the guide's error cost Terry critical hours, leaving Custer's 650 men to face 1,500 warriors alone. The 10 Crow scouts, riding ahead 2 miles, found no trace of the 7,000-person village or Custer's command. The 400 troops, unaware of the 265 dead 3 miles south, camped under the stars, their Gatling gun silent beside 5,000 pounds of rations. On the 27th of June, Terry's 400 men encountered 3 of Custer's Crow scouts. White Man runs him, Harry Moccasin, and goes ahead near the Little Bighorn. The scouts, their faces painted and rifles in hand, rode 2 miles to meet Terry's column, reporting the annihilation of Custer's 225 men and the survival of Reno's 350. White Man runs him, gesturing south, described 265 bodies scattered across 3 miles, a catastrophe confirmed by 800 warrior tracks, Historian Robert M. Utley states, "The scouts' report shattered Terry's expectations, revealing the 7 Thieves' collapse. The 400 troops, with 20,000 rounds, prepared to advance, as the 7,000-person village, with 2,000 fighters, moved upstream, evading pursuit after their victory. Terry, his kepi in hand, struggled to accept the news, standing beside his horse as the Crow scouts spoke. He declared it impossible that the 650-man 7th Cavalry, with 34,000 rounds, could suffer such a defeat against 1,500 warriors. His 400 men, including 200 cavalry and 150 infantry, carried 20,000 rounds and 5,000 pounds of rations, expecting to reinforce Custer's command." Ambrose notes, Terry's disbelief reflected the Army's underestimation of the Sioux and Cheyenne's 2,000 warriors. The 10 Crow Scouts, riding 300 horses, confirmed the loss of 265 men, including Custer's 225, 3 miles south. The 400 troops, now 1.5 miles from the battlefield, faced the grim task of confirming the 7,000-person village's triumph. Advancing on the 27th of June, Terry's 400 men found chilling evidence of the battle. 2 abandoned teepees, 500 yards apart, held the bodies of 5 Sioux warriors, their weapons beside them. Nearby, the 200 cavalry troopers discovered the severed heads of 3 white soldiers, a gruesome marker of the 1,500 warriors' ferocity. Scattered across 200 yards were Captain George Yates's gloves, Lieutenant James Porter's buckskin jacket, and Lieutenant James Sturgis's underwear, relics of Custer's 225-man command. Philbrick writes, "These artifacts, found 3 miles from Reno's 350 survivors, confirmed the 7 Thieves' annihilation. The 400 troops, with 20,000 rounds, moved 1.5 miles to the battlefield as the 7,000-person village's 2,000 fighters vanished, leaving a haunting legacy of their victory." Lieutenant James Bradley, leading 20 scouts on the east bank of the Little Bighorn River, was the first to uncover the grim fate of General George Custer's command on the 27th of June, 1875. Bradley, his kepi shielding his eyes, rode his horse across 2 miles of rugged terrain, his rifle slung across his back. His scouts, including 10 Crow allies, spotted 265 bodies scattered across 3 miles, marking the annihilation of Custer's 225-man force by 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. The scene 5 miles from General Alfred Terry's 400-man column, revealed 200 carbines and 50 revolvers strewn among the dead. Historian Robert M. Utley writes, "Bradley's discovery confirmed the catastrophic loss, a blow to the 7th Cavalry's 650-man strength. The 400 troops, with 20,000 rounds and 5,000 pounds of rations, advanced toward the battlefield, unaware that 350 survivors under Captain Frederick Benteen held a 500-yard perimeter 3 miles away against the 7,000-person native village's defenders. Terry, his gray beard dust-caked, received Bradley's report and informed the 350 survivors on the bluffs of Custer's fate. Standing beside his horse, his right hand on his saber, Terry addressed Major Marcus Reno's 170 men, Benteen's 120, and Captain Thomas McDougall's 50 pack train guards. The news, delivered 1.5 miles from the battlefield, shattered hopes as Reno's force, down from 210 with 40 killed and 35 wounded, grappled with the loss of 265 comrades. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick notes, Terry's revelation crushed the 7 Thieves' morale, confirming the 1,500 warriors' dominance. The 350 survivors, with 34,000 rounds, including 24,000 from the pack train, stood on a 200-foot bluff, their 150 rifle pits and 200 saddles scant protection against the 2,000 fighters who had defended their 7,000-person village with unmatched resolve. Benteen, his blue tunic unbuttoned, reacted with skepticism, standing among the 350 survivors. Holding his reins in his left hand, He speculated that Custer was grazing horses 10 miles down the Bighorn, citing his abandonment of troops at the Wachita in 1873. His 120 men, with 6,000 rounds, listened as he referenced Custer's earlier tactic, where 100 men were left behind during a retreat. Historian Evan S. Connell calls Benteen's remark a bitter jab, born of rivalry and disbelief. The 170 survivors of Reno's command, with 3,400 rounds and 50 pack train guards, with 4,000 rounds, faced the reality of 265 dead, including Custer's 225. The 1,500 warriors, with 200 repeating rifles firing 1,000 rounds per minute, had overwhelmed Custer's force, leaving the 650-man regiment's remnants to mourn. Terry, exasperated by Benteen's comments, ordered him to investigate Last Stand Hill, 3 miles north. Terry, his kepi in hand, stood beside his horse, his voice firm as he directed Benteen to lead his 40-man Company H with 2,000 rounds to the site. The order, issued 1.5 miles from the battlefield, aimed to silence Benteen's doubts and confirm the 265 deaths. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose states, Terry's command forced Benteen to face the truth, ending his denial. The 400-man column with 20,000 rounds prepared to advance, while the 350 survivors, including 170 from Reno's battered force, held their 500-yard perimeter against the 1,500 warriors who had moved upstream with their 7,000-person village. Benteen, his saber clinking, rode to Last Stand Hill with his 40 troopers, covering 3 miles in 20 minutes at 9 miles per hour. Dismounting, he walked across the 200-yard killing field, where 265 bodies lay among 200 carbines and 50 revolvers. A trooper, his carbine in hand, pointed to a body believed to be Custer's, clad in a buckskin jacket. Benteen, his face grim, confirmed, "By God, that is him," his voice low. The 225 men of Custer's command, surrounded by 1,500 warriors, had fired 10,000 rounds in a 30-minute stand. Philbrick writes, Benteen's confirmation sealed the 7th's tragedy, a loss driven by division. The 350 survivors, 3 miles south with 34,000 rounds, faced no further attack as the 2,000 warrior force protected their 7,000-person village. Benteen remounted his horse and rode back, leaving the 265 bodies on Last Stand Hill. His 40-man company, with 2,000 rounds, returned 3 miles to the 350 survivors in 20 minutes, their hoofbeats echoing across the bluffs. The 1,500 warriors, including 200 with repeaters, had achieved a decisive victory, their 7,000-person village safe for now. Connell notes, Benteen's terse reaction at Last Stand Hill reflected a commander hardened by loss. The 400-man column under Terry with 20,000 rounds reached the site soon after, confirming the 265 dead. The 350 survivors, with 150 rifle pits and 34,000 rounds, mourned the 650-man regiment's collapse as the native triumph reshaped the Sioux War's narrative. The 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, with 200 repeating rifles and 1,300 bows, executed a tactical masterpiece against Custer's 225 men. Their 7,000-person village, including 2,000 women and children, drove their resolve as they outmaneuvered the 650-man 7th Cavalry across 5 miles of battlefield. Historian John S. Gray argues, the native strategy exploited Custer's division, isolating his 225 men from Reno's 210 and Benteen's 120. The warriors, firing 1,000 rounds per minute, overwhelmed Custer's 10,000 rounds in 30 minutes, while Reno's 170 survivors and Benteen's 120 held 34,000 rounds on the bluffs. The 400-man relief column, arriving too late with 20,000 rounds, underscored the 1,500 warriors' dominance in defending their homeland. Major Reno's failures crippled the 7th Cavalry's response. His 210-man force, reduced to 170 with 40 killed and 35 wounded, retreated after expending 8,000 rounds in 20 minutes against 800 warriors. His 30-minute absence to find Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson's body and failure to scout the 1,500 warriors' movements left 350 troops blind. Utley states, Reno's indecision, costing 265 lives, was a leadership collapse unmatched in the Sioux War. The 170 survivors, with 3,400 rounds, relied on Benteen's 120 men and 6,000 rounds to survive,